Margaret was the quietest resident at Sunset Manor nursing home. Same routine for 12 years. Morning newspaper, afternoon in the garden, early to bed. But the young medical intern had started noticing something odd. She was constantly observing the security camera positions and never turned her back to the door. That morning, everything was about to change. Welcome to Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful tale, tell us in the comments, what city in the world are you watching from? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us keep these voices alive. Sunset Manor sat in a quiet corner of Connecticut, a typical nursing home with white painted walls, well-maintained gardens, and the familiar atmosphere of muted television sounds drifting from every room. Among the 47 residents living there, Margaret Thompson was the least noticeable person of all. At 74, medium height with neatly arranged gray hair, Margaret had maintained the same routine for 12 years. Wake up at 6:30 every morning, read her newspaper, sit in the garden after lunch, lights out by 8 p.m. No visitors ever came, no phone calls were made. Her file simply read, retired government employee. Young medical intern David Chen was in his final year of medical school, working his geriatrics rotation at this nursing home, and he had a habit of carefully observing every patient. When he first saw Margaret, she seemed like just another ordinary elderly woman, but as weeks passed, he began noticing strange details. Margaret never turned her back to the door. Whether eating, watching TV, or sitting in the garden, she always positioned herself where she could see the exits. David had thought it was coincidence, until he realized she was calculating the angles of the security cameras in her room. She had another peculiar habit. Every day at exactly 2:30 p.m., she'd go out to the garden and sit for exactly 47 minutes. When David got curious and observed her, he was surprised. Though Margaret appeared to be sitting casually, she was actually constantly scanning her surroundings, watching every movement around her. There's something about this woman, David thought, but he couldn't figure out what. That critical morning, David went to Margaret's room for a routine check. Margaret was in her usual spot by the window, reading her newspaper. As David approached, he noticed Margaret wasn't reading at all. She was watching the hallway through the pages. "Good morning, Margaret," David said. "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine, doctor," Margaret replied, but her eyes were still focused on something behind David at the door. David turned around. Two men were standing in the hallway, suited, serious-faced, scanning their surroundings. People he'd never seen at the nursing home before. When he looked back at Margaret, he saw her expression had changed. She was no longer a relaxed, elderly woman. Her body language had tensioned, her eyes had sharpened, as if a switch had been flipped. She'd returned to 40 years ago. "Margaret," David called. "Is something wrong?" Margaret slowly stood up. Even the way she moved had changed. The awkwardness that comes with age was gone. Her steps were calculated, her posture straight. "Dr. Chen," Margaret said. Her voice had changed too. No longer the trembling voice of an elderly woman, but clear and decisive. "Could you close the door so those men don't see me?" David was confused, but closed the door. When he turned around, he saw that Margaret was a completely different person, as if she'd dropped the role she'd been playing for 12 years. "Who are those men?" David asked. Margaret looked out the window. The men were waiting in the nursing home's garden, examining the area. "From where I used to work," Margaret said. "I think my retirement ends today." David was confused. "I don't understand. Weren't you a government employee?" Margaret smiled slightly, the first genuine smile in 12 years. "Technically, yes, but nobody ever asked which department I worked for." That's when David understood. Margaret's habits, constantly being alert, never turning her back. These weren't behaviors of paranoid old age. They were the result of professional training. "You worked in intelligence?" David asked, lowering his voice. Margaret nodded. 38 years. I wanted to live quietly in retirement, but apparently someone I used to know has found me." A soft knock was heard at the door. Margaret immediately went on alert. She signaled David to be quiet. "Miss Thompson?" A voice came from the hallway. "We need to talk." Margaret took a deep breath. After 12 years, her past had found her. "Dr. Chen," Margaret said, "what I'm about to ask you will seem strange, but trust me. There's a package inside the wall behind my room. If I don't come out of this room today, deliver the package to the FBI." David's mouth hung open. "Margaret, what's happening?" Margaret stood up, completely abandoning her elderly woman pose. Now standing before him wasn't a 74-year-old woman, but an experienced operative. "I did certain jobs in the past. I protected certain secrets. Now those secrets are finding me." The door opened. Two men entered. Serious-faced, professional. "Margaret Phantom Thompson," the first man said. It's been a long time. Margaret looked at them. Miller, still wearing the same suit. And you too, Williams. How did you find me? You never disappeared, Miller said. You just weren't on the watch list until an old file was opened last week. David stood frozen on the side. Margaret had a code name. Phantom. Ghost. What do you want? Margaret asked. An old operation has been reopened. We need your testimony. Margaret shook her head. I'm retired. Unfortunately, that's not an option in this matter. Then Margaret started laughing. A real, deep laugh. I've been waiting here for 12 years, for when you'd come. It took much longer than I imagined. David was trying to understand. So you... Really? I was a former CIA operative, Dr. Chen. Known by the code name Phantom. I worked in Eastern Bloc countries. I was involved in some very classified operations. Miller interrupted. Margaret, we need to go. Margaret looked at David. Dr. Chen, thank you for the kindness you've shown me these 12 years. It's the first time in a long time I've been treated like a normal person. David was still in shock. So what happens now? I'm going back. There's one last mission. Margaret packed her bag. She had very few belongings, just like someone always ready to flee. She walked toward the door with the men. At the door, she stopped and turned to David. Dr. Chen, don't tell this story to anyone, and that package, don't forget. After Margaret left, David stood frozen. He had just learned that the quiet, elderly woman he'd known for 12 years was actually a former CIA agent. That evening, David checked the wall behind Margaret's room. There really was a small package. Inside were old photographs, documents, and a note. If you're reading this package, things must have gone wrong. These documents are my life insurance. David delivered the package to the FBI. A few weeks later, a small news item appeared in the papers. Former CIA operative provides critical testimony. 40-year-old missing file closed. Margaret never returned to the nursing home, but David never forgot. Sometimes the most ordinary-seeming people have the most extraordinary pasts. Did this story touch you? Have you ever learned a surprising truth about someone ordinary you knew? Share in the comments. And if you believe stories of silent heroes like this deserve to be told, subscribe. At Human Stories, we share powerful stories like this every week.